In this video, you'll learn how to create some fancy grainy gradients and make images look more realistic. Let's go. Hey, welcome to a new Tuts Plus tutorial. If we're just meeting, my name is Adi Purdila. I am a web designer, and my goal with these videos is to help you become a better web designer and developer. Now, let's talk about noise. In design, this can be used to add texture and depth to an otherwise solid color or smooth gradient. For example, take a look at these beautiful pieces by Brad Hansen on Dribbble. See how much more depth is added to the composition simply by using noise? It's a really cool technique that can be easily implemented in pretty much any design software nowadays. Either that's Figma, Photoshop, Illustrator, XD, and so on. But what about CSS? Well, it's totally doable in CSS thanks to SVG filters. So if you don't want your gradients to look as smooth as a baby's bottom, let me show you how you can add some noise with CSS and SVG. After a quick message from Envato Elements. With one subscription, you'll have unlimited access to illustrations, web and email templates, graphic templates, and more. There are millions of digital assets to choose from. They have simple commercial licensing, and you can cancel anytime. Subscribe now using the link in the video description. All right, now let's make some noise. So we start by defining an SVG element, and we're going to set its view box to just a random size. Let's do 243, 243. And then inside the SVG, we're going to define a filter, and let's give this an ID of, let's say, noise filter. And inside, we're going to use FE turbulence. This is the filter that we're going to use. The type for this is fractal noise. That's what it's called. And you can add some additional options like the base frequency. We're going to set ours to 1.3. And then let's define a rectangle. We can actually do it like this. And let's give it a width of 100%, a height of 100%. And we're going to say filter equals URL noise filter. And there you have it. The easiest way to generate noise in CSS. Well, it's not actually CSS because we haven't written any CSS, but it's easiest using SVGs. And if you play around with this base frequency, for example, you can increase its value, and you'll see that as you increase the base frequency, the dots in the noise get smaller and smaller. Now, if you want to use CSS, you can do that. Let's define an element here, and inside the CSS, I'm just going to write some basic styling for the body to center our element. And then when we get to it, we can say width, height, and let's do a border radius of 50 rems. Let's make a circle. And then if we want to add a gradient, right, besides the noise, we can do background. We can say radial gradient. And we're going to say circle at 30% and 90%. And then some RGBA values. So this is the one color stop, and the other, let's just make it black. Like so. Right, so that's going to define this gradient here. To add our noise, we can simply add another background, this time in the form of a URL. So what we can do is we can actually copy the SVG data. So I'm going to copy this bit and we need to convert it. That's really easy to do. You can Google SVG to base 64, and that's going to take you to a converter. For example, this one from Yoxel. Just paste in your SVG code, and then you can just copy the stuff that's inside the URL right here. It also gives you a preview, which is really nice. So then you would go in and paste that in your URL. And there it is. Now you have a noise mixed with a gradient. And if you want, on top of this, you can add a filter, a CSS filter, to increase the contrast and brightness. So contrast, let's put it at 200%, and brightness at, let's say, 250. And that's just going to make this noise really, really visible. So to recap, 2 ingredients for this recipe. You add the SVG data as a background to the element that you want, and you can mix that up with a gradient of your choosing, and optionally increase the contrast and brightness. Now, if you want to play around with this technique, there's also a playground that can be found at this address right here. And this is an interactive playground, so you can basically choose the dimensions of your SVG, the base frequency of your gradient. You can see the end result here. You know, you can play around with the different options, and at the very end, you can grab the SVG from here and the CSS from here, which is pretty cool. You'll find this linked down below. Now, something else you can use Grainy gradients is for a gradient mesh. And this is something really cool. If you don't know what a gradient mesh is, take a look at this. Right? This composition, this is basically just a lot of gradients blended together. And we have really cool tools like Mesher from CSS Hero that actually allows us to create our own mesh as we see fit and change the various colors here. And just to demonstrate how you would use this with noise, let's go ahead and copy the CSS. And then we're going to go to our code pen, and let's work directly on the body element here. And we can actually get rid of the background image because we need to add another background as the noise. But before we do that, let me just set a height here because Safari kind of bugs out. So then I can simply add another background as a URL, and we're going to do exactly the same thing as before. Right, we're going to use this SVG right here. So just paste that in. Or if you want, you can go to the playground I showed you earlier and choose the gradient that you want here. Let's increase this. Let's say, I don't know, something like this. Num octaves. Let's, I don't know, bump this up to the max. And then I can just come down here. I can say inline the SVG, and I can copy the URL directly and just replace it. Right, and that's going to give me a gradient mesh that also has noise mixed in there. It's not very visible in this example, but if you look closely at your display, you'll be able to see the noise, and it adds quite a nice texture to the mesh. With that said, there is another way of creating mesh gradients with noise, and I'm about to show you that right now. So let's go ahead and create a new pen here. And we start by defining an SVG like so. So again, we added a filter, we called it noise filter, we added the turbulence, set a base frequency to this value, although you can change this to your liking. Num octaves the same, stitch tiles the same. Honestly, I don't know exactly what these are doing. I just know they offer you a way to customize the amount of noise you create and how that noise looks like. So if you want to go more in depth about how these work, you can just look up FE turbulence and you'll find all the options for it there. So then inside the CSS, and this is actually a technique that I learned from Anna Tudor. She's a very talented developer. What you do is you basically decide what element you want to apply the noise to, and then you define a before and an after pseudo element. So in my case, I'm going to work with the body. So I'm going to say body before and body after. And then inside, I'll do the usual position absolute. I'm going to set the top and left to 0. Blank content. I'm going to set a width and a height to 100%. I'm going to set a z index to -1 to be able to stack these properly. And then on the before pseudo element, I'm going to set the background to black, and I'm going to set the filter URL noise filter. And this will basically take us right here, right? It uses this filter that we defined in the SVG. And we now have the noise added to the before pseudo element. And then on the after pseudo element, we add our gradient or our color or whatever we want to add here. So I went into Mesher again, and I created a nice gradient mesh, and I just pasted that right here. Now here's the cool part. The noise is already coming through, but you can also use mix blend modes on these two elements. So you can change the way they blend together by using the mix blend mode CSS property, and you would set that to, for example, color. Now, this doesn't really work here in Safari, and that's because if we open Can I Use and we search for mix blend mode, you can see that on Safari, when it comes to blending of HTML and SVG elements, Safari doesn't support certain mix blend modes. So it doesn't support hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. But there are several other blend modes. So if we go to MDN under mix blend mode, we can see the full list right here. So let's go for example, multiply or screen. So instead of color, if we choose multiply, then these two elements will blend together, the noise and the gradient mesh. Let's choose darken, for example. That's another blend mode. Right? So this gives you a little bit of a different result. So you can play around with these blend modes. And of course, keep in mind that some of these do not work in Safari, which is what I'm using to preview it right now. But they should work just fine in other browsers. But yeah, that's the second way of creating a gradient mesh with noise. You basically define two pseudo elements before and after. One of them contains the SVG filter and the other contains the color. And then you just blend them together, optionally with mix blend mode. All right, now what about making a noisy image? Let's say you're loading an image as a background and you want to give it some more texture, some more depth. Well, you can actually add some noise on top of that image using the exact same technique that I showed you previously for creating a noisy gradient mesh. So we start with two pseudo elements, just like before. In the HTML part, we have the SVG defined with our noise. And then on the before pseudo element, we can do exactly the same thing, just a black background, and then add the noise filter. And then on the after pseudo element, we can set up a background as URL. We can link to our image, In my case, I just uploaded an illustration to CodePen, and I'm linking directly. And for this image, I want to center it, and I don't want to make it repeat. Let's also set the background size as cover so it fills up the entire screen. And now all we have to do is blend the image and the noise. For that, we'll go back here and we'll play around with the mix blend modes. So let's start, for example, with darken. All right. See, there's the noise coming in through the lighter areas of the image. We can even use our own filter to boost the contrast. Let's say to 100%. And maybe the brightness to 150%. Right, and that's just going to make it more visible. Or we can choose another mix blend mode, let's say difference. And that's going to create a totally different look. Maybe exclusion. It was another option I played around with. Multiply. Right, so this gives us yet another look. I think multiply gives us the best results so far because it adds noise in predominantly in the lighter areas of the image, but also we can see it seeping through in the darker areas of the image. So this is a very simple technique. As I said before, 2 elements, a before and an after. You set a mix blend mode on both of them. And then one, usually the before, has the SVG noise filter, and the other has the image. And optionally, you can use a filter to boost the contrast or brightness. And just like that, you now successfully added noise to an image. Now, browser support for this technique is very good because the only properties that we really need to care about are filter, and filter, as you can see, is very well supported, and also mix blend mode, which, as I showed you previously, is also very well supported, with the exception of Safari, which has some issues when blending of HTML and SVG elements. But other than that, it's really well supported, so there's no reason you shouldn't add some noise to your gradients or images today. All right, time for some key takeaways. Noise can be used to add texture to a solid color or smooth gradient. In CSS, start by using the FE turbulence noise filter on an SVG element. Then apply a background with a gradient and the SVG filter. If necessary, use a CSS filter to increase the noise, brightness, and contrast. Optionally, use mix blend mode to better blend the gradient and noise. And that's it, folks. That's how you can add some texture to your images or gradients by using noise. Now, I'm curious, would you use this technique? And if you would, what would it be used for? Let us know down in the comments. With that said, thank you very much for watching. I'm Adi, and until next time, take care.